I'm Jonathan Kinsel, and this is my entry for the Story Behind a Story podcast, where today I'll be interviewing John Branch, a New York Times reporter who won a Pulitzer for his piece called Snowfall, and about his path to get to the New York Times. So, just to get started, how'd you go from being a student in Colorado to being a Pulitzer-winning journalist?
How much time do you have? So the 30-second or 60-second version is that I went back to grad school. I was actually working at a Costco in Denver, and I was in my late 20s and decided that's not exactly what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And so I went back to grad school at the University of Colorado and got my journalism master's, and then got a job in Colorado Springs and bounced around a little bit. Sort of worked my way up through a couple different papers, as a business writer, as a sports reporter, as a sports columnist. And then the New York Times hired me in 2005. So I've been there. It'll be 15 years this month.
Wow. So what's the main lesson that you learned from bouncing around the smaller newspapers on your path to the New York Times?
I learned a lot of things. Mainly, I think that, we have to remember when we write feature stories and when we do anything in this business, that all the most important stories are human stories. And sometimes we write about quirky little things about stats or something. But the best stories are always really about humans. And it doesn't really matter if they're a sports story or if it's a story about somebody going through some sort of disaster or troubling time in their life. It's really about the emotion and about the human experience. And, the older I get, maybe the wiser I get, to the fact that all these stories are somewhat the same, and that it doesn't really matter what the circumstances are, that the core of the best stories are what it's like to be living and in some cases dying, and to make these stories personal as possible.
Yeah.
My favorite stories are the ones that feel like it's a personal story as opposed to something that feels very impersonal.
Yeah. So now to the piece that won you that Pulitzer that I talked about earlier. When you first heard about the avalanche that were happening in Washington State, what were your initial thoughts?
I wasn't really attuned to it until a couple months after it happened, actually. The Times did write a story about it when it happened. Let me take that back. It wrote a story about that avalanche and a couple of other avalanches when it happened. But it wasn't until a couple months later that an editor and I were talking about avalanches and decided that maybe that was a genre that was ripe for some reporting. And so it was only after I started investigating avalanches that I kind of rediscovered that avalanche. It was the deadliest one of that prior season. And slowly just started working my way through the reporting process of that, really with no idea of where it was going. I just thought it was going to be just another story of, a couple thousand that I think I've written so far for the New York Times. But it just sort of grew and grew and grew until it became, a big project that ended up getting a lot of attention. But it started very innocently.
So when did you first come across the story of the people that are at the center of your article?
So I knew of it when it happened, or within a couple of days of it when it happened, but it was not my beat. It was not anything that was on my radar until probably 2 or 3 months later. And so it was when I started looking at the subject of avalanches and what seemed to be a trend of more and more deadly avalanches across the globe that I discovered that was the deadliest one of the year. And so that's when I started trying to figure out who was involved in it, and just started doing what all reporters do, and that is started calling and emailing and trying to research best as I could who the people were that were involved and seeing if I could persuade them to talk to me.
Yeah, so when you first heard their stories, did you automatically think that, you could write this full 4-section feature on it?
No, not at all. It wasn't until I was probably a month or two into the reporting that I realized that this could be bigger than just even a pretty decent sized feature story. And we had no preconceived notions for this. I mean, when I started reporting it, if you would have asked me that day, I would have said, well, hopefully I'll get a 1,000-word story out of this or 2,000-word story out of this. There was nobody involved from our graphics team. There was nobody involved from our video or photo departments. It was just me making phone calls. And there was no ambition that this would turn into anything big. It just became that as a reporting sort of unfurled, and we started getting more and more information and started realizing this had potential as a storytelling vehicle, that it became, what I think now people consider Snowfall. It didn't have a title until really at the very end, actually. So yeah, it really did start very innocently and very organically. We had no clue it was going to become a big deal.
Yeah. So why did you decide to, split it up into those 4 separate sections?
Like when you see it online?
Yes.
As it's kind of divided? Yeah. Well, one, it's incredibly long. I think at the time it was the longest story the New York Times had ever published. Single story. It's, 15,000 plus words.
Wow.
And a typical New York Times story is maybe 1,500. Mm-hmm. So it's 10 times longer than a regular story. And so we had to break it up anyway. And so I think it's broken up basically into chapters, best as I could sort of delineate where chapters should fall. And when we then overlaid it with all the graphics, when our graphics team did that, we talked about where the chapter breaks should be, if they were in the right place where I had kind of written them, or if we should shift them around a little bit to create, as you see, the visual elements that kind of create different sections of Snowfall. Now I forget how many there are, 5 maybe. Yeah. But divided up by those kind of pretty little ephemeral pictures of snow falling, and just to try to give the reader a sense like we're moving on to the next chapter. Yeah. So part of it happened organically as I wrote it, and then part of it was, okay, this is a reasonable section break for people who are scrolling through this. This seems like a spot where people might want to stop and take a breath because it was a long story.
Yeah, so you briefly touched on this earlier, but whenever you go online and look at the article, there's a lot of multimedia elements that take up the full screen and really make the reader focus on them. So is that part of the design, your choice, or you had like a say in that design?
No. I'll say yes and no. We had a graphics team that put together the graphics, and my role in it was a non-technical role as a consultant. Okay. Basically, I was the one who reported a lot of the information that is in the graphics. And once the graphics were created by people much smarter than me, my role was to try to make sure that they made sense and they fit in with the story. So it was, my role was really on the front end, like what graphics would help tell the story, and then more on the back end, do these graphics work for what you're trying to say in the story. But, it took a lot of time for a lot of our graphic designers and graphic artists to create all those. And those guys and women were doing things that I don't know how to do.
Yeah. So what do you think multimedia elements can achieve in today's world of journalism?
Yeah, I think one thing that a takeaway from Snowfall is just how important it is. It can be important to blend these elements. I think even in our own newsroom before Snowfall, we would often have a text and we might have some photos we kind of plop in with it, and maybe a video or something that we'd plop in with it, and maybe a map or some sort of graphic. And this was really the first major project the Times did that really blended all those elements together. And so as you're reading it or as you're scrolling through it, the words kind of bleed a little bit into some moving pictures or into a moving graphic. And we really blended those elements together more than we ever had before. And I think the idea is, instead of having a bunch of stationary chunks, let's see if we can kind of merge them all together. And I think that's probably part of the Snowfall legacy is using those different elements to help tell a better and richer story.
Yeah, no, I would say that the Times, is one of the best publications at incorporating those in articles. So,
no doubt.
Yeah,
and we have a managing editor whose name is Steve Duenas, who was really kind of the lead guy on the design of Snowfall, and he's still there. And so we're lucky to have him.
Yeah. So with the Times now being so good at incorporating multimedia elements, do you kind of look back at Snowfall with more pride because you kind of started the multimedia elements at the New York Times?
Yeah, I'm very proud of it. I'm proud of it because I know what a collaborative effort it was. I know how many different departments in the newsroom pulled together in ways that maybe they always hadn't always previously. And I know that it then sort of opened up the imagination, I think, to a lot of different departments in the newsroom about the possibilities. I mean, I had no vision for this, certainly at the time that I was reporting it and writing it. But it goes to show you that if you blend a good team together, you can create things that still dazzle, but most importantly, inform. And that's where I'm most proud of Snowfall, is that as dazzling as it is, I feel like it's a wonderful project of journalism. You know, all those elements are there to educate, not just to dazzle. And I'm really proud of the work that went into it, and the fact that people still, 7-8 years later, still care enough to talk about it.
Yeah. So after writing Snowfall, did you keep any lessons with you throughout the rest of your time at the Times so far?
To what I was saying there is and I think the lesson I've learned, and I think has been learned across a good part of the newsroom, is get other people involved in your stories early on. I think for a long time, reporters especially, felt a sense of ownership over their own stories, and they wanted to kind of keep it to themselves until they were ready to unveil it at the last possible second to editors or to the photo desk or to the graphics desk.
Yeah.
And now the lesson that we've all learned is, when you have an idea, bring those ideas before you even done much of anything to other departments, because they might have ideas of ways to tell the story. And in some cases, as you've seen with the New York Times graphics, maybe the best way to tell a story is not through words at all. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's simply through a graphic, or maybe it's simply through a photo essay. We used to think that we had to tell everything through words, and now we've sort of opened up our imagination about trying to discover what the best way for the readers is to absorb a story. And that's kind of exciting, because then every story has the potential to be something different.
Yeah, so now as a professional journalist, what advice do you have for college students who are trying to become journalists in today's society?
We need you more than ever, as daunting as it may seem to try to get into this field during these crazy times. My advice is that understanding the necessity of learning how to do a little bit of everything, mm-hmm. and realizing that chances are your first job is going to require you to write, take pictures, design pages, and do a little bit of everything. My advice is find your passion within those. Is that I think it's great to be a jack of all trades, but I think it's important to have a passion for one thing that you do really, really well, that you really love to do.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I really appreciate this, and I'm not gonna lie. Whenever I DM'd something from the New York Times, I wasn't technically expecting to get a response, but I really appreciate it.
No, I'm always happy to help students whenever I can. So if you have anything else, don't be shy. Just give me a shout.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jonathan.
Have a good night.
Man. Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.